This is Pastor Jeff Chavis. I'm coming to you from Las Vegas, Nevada. I am the pastor of Church Online. We're a unique online community of faith, and you can find us online at churchonline.com, but we spell it uniquely, CHRCH, churchonline.com. We say all that's missing is you. This morning, of course, it is Good Friday, and I want to wish you all a Good Friday. And of course, when we realize the Good Friday is the story of Jesus on the cross, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around Good Friday and why this is good. There's a song out now by a young man named Phil Wickham, and he says, Friday's good because Sunday is coming. And that's the reality. The cross of Jesus is maybe the most painful, humiliating, horrifying way for a person to die, but we think about how important it is. This morning, I'm thinking about the timing of it all because right now it's 10 o'clock in the morning in the central time zone. And if we fast forwarded ourselves to that day or back, we rewinded back to that time when it actually happened in Israel, Jesus actually would have been on the cross now for more than an hour because it tells us in Mark's gospel, chapter 15, verse 25, it says it was the third hour and they crucified him. And the way they understand timing in those early days was sundown begins the day. The day actually begins what we think of as evening time. We think of our new day being midnight. They thought of their day as happening at sundown. So at sundown on the day, they have the Passover. That's when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Jesus celebrated the Passover. Jesus releases Judas to go do what he must do. It is there at that Passover. He breaks the bread and says, This is my body that is broken for you. Then they head out into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is there for quite a while, praying, sweating drops of blood. The disciples can't even keep their eyes open. He goes back to them 3 times. Don't know exactly all of the timing of the exact timing of that evening, but it was during that time that he's taken to the chief priest, put on trial. It's still under the cover of darkness. Because if you remember how the story goes, they're going through the process with Jesus, and that's when Peter is out denying him. And then the rooster crows at his third denial. So it's still darkness until, and for those of you that are familiar with roosters, the rooster crows when the twilight comes. It may be just not quite light yet, but still a little bit of twilight happening. So all of that being done under the cover of darkness. And then Mark's Gospel, chapter 15, tells us, verse 1, immediately in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. The Jewish leaders were not allowed to enact the death penalty as they wanted to do to Jesus. So they had to take him to Pilate, and it seems like they didn't waste any time. From daybreak, when the rooster crows, it says in Mark's gospel, immediately when it was morning. So sometime before daybreak and 9 o'clock in the morning, they take Jesus to Pilate. We go through the process. Jesus whipped and beaten, brought out before the crowd. Behold the man, Pilate says, and then the crowd cries, crucify him. This is all taking place before 9 o'clock in the morning. They place the cross on his back, and he walks up that Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, up to the place of the skull, Golgotha. They nail him to that cross, and the cross stands by the 9th hour, by 9 o'clock in the morning, or sorry, the third hour, as they say, 9 o'clock in the morning. But where I want to take you in the scripture is as Jesus is on the cross, Mark gives us a little more detail about that timing. As I said, in Mark 15:25, it tells us it was the third hour when they crucified him. Then we skip down to Mark 15:33 when it was the 6th hour. Now, remember, we count the hours from daybreak, and then we set a 1-hour time clock. So say 6 o'clock in the morning, the third hour is 9 o'clock, the 6th hour is noon. So now Jesus hanging there for 3 hours in agony, in pain, his wounds on his back, the wounds in his hands and his feet, the crown of thorns on his head. Jesus, 3 hours in suffering. And then listen to the words. When the 6th hour had come, now there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So Jesus hanging there from 9 o'clock in the morning till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 6 hours in agony, 6 hours in humiliation, 6 hours on display for all of Jerusalem to see, hanging there, slowly, slowly dying. And it tells us at the 9th hour, and this is Mark 15:34, at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? Some of those who stood by, when they heard that, said, look, he's calling for Elijah. And others ran and filled a sponge full of sour wine and put it on a reed and offered it to him to drink, saying, let him alone. Let us see if Elijah comes to take him down. And Jesus cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last. Sometime after 3 o'clock, Jesus cries those words. Now, Luke's gospel says that that final phrase was, it is finished. Now, there's some interesting things that were happening at this moment. It is the day of Passover. That evening, so many people all over the city of Jerusalem were remembering the day when God set the captives free in Egypt so many thousands of years before. And then we continue the Passover celebration the next morning. For most families, it's a time for prayer. It's a holy day. At the 9th hour, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the high priest would go into the temple area and sacrifice for the nation of Israel. And it isn't by accident, it isn't by coincidence that that process continued to take place. And Jesus is crying out, it is finished. That says volumes about all that was being remembered on that day by the Jews all over Jerusalem. But I'm often taken just to think, what was everyone else doing in Jerusalem as Jesus is hanging on that hill? I promise you, everywhere in Jerusalem you could see it. There's Jesus along with the two thieves on either side of him. And for most of Israel, they just continued on with their day-to-day things, their day-to-day Passover celebration, their day-to-day remembrance celebration. And it made me think, yes, that is the same as it is with us in our day, isn't it? We think about this day, the day we are reminded of Jesus being placed on the cross, and do we just let this day go? Do we just go about our normal everyday business without a thought to Jesus on the cross? Or is this day something important to us? Oh, I understand. Some people question whether it was Friday or maybe it was a Thursday. That's not the point. The point is we have this day to remember. In fact, Jesus gave us those words that evening before he broke bread and said, this is my body that is broken for you. As often as you do this in remembrance of me. So we need to have that regular remembrance of the cross, yearly remembrance of the cross today. I don't know if you'll be going to a Good Friday service or celebration at your church. We're going to do one online, but always being reminded, placing the cross before us, the humiliation, the pain. And Jesus wanted us all to remember that day, to remember that moment, to do this in remembrance of me, as he said. We don't ever want to lose sight of the significance. Maybe it's something that we do in our churches on a monthly, weekly basis. Maybe it's something that we need to remember every single day. Jesus died in a painful, humiliating way on that cross for us. For God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Good Friday reminds us that it was that day, on that instrument of torture, that God gave his one and only Son. And for those of us who believe, it means everything. So today on this Good Friday, if you could just pause for a moment and remember, and maybe even better, if you could share it with somebody else, but don't just do this once a year, right? It needs to be a regular thing. As often as we do this in remembrance of him.